Hello and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, your go-to podcast for everything soilless cultivation. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Sharp, and today we're talking about a disease or a pathogen that shouldn't be as much of a problem in hydroponics as it is in outdoor cultivation. However, it is still a big issue, especially in crops that are just about to be harvested and crops that have been harvested, so what we call post-harvest, which is really frustrating because you can get your crop all the way. You can spend months and months and months growing it, and then it can all succumb to this one pathogen, which is grey mold, or more scientifically, botrytis cinerea. There are a few different types of botrytis. There's one specific to pea crops, but botrytis cinerea is the catch-all one that affects most crops. It's a fungus, and it thrives in moist conditions and can devastate hydroponic crops from strawberries to ornamentals. So let's dive into its biology, how it's spread, and the best control strategies for indoor growers or glasshouse or polytunnel growers. So the first thing to note is that it's a saprotrophic fungus. This means that it feeds on decaying plant tissue, but it also can behave as a necrotroph in that it just kills and feeds on living cells. However, it will gain much more of a foothold and much easier if there is dead, decaying material lying around your greenhouse, your glasshouse, your grow room. So it spreads via airborne spores and can cross-infect multiple plant species. So this is not like powdery mildew, which is specific to one plant or one plant species. This plant can go from your strawberries to your tomatoes to your hops and just hop around. It survives on plant debris, cuttings and fallen petals. So cleanliness is next to godliness when it comes to controlling grey mold. Also, controlling humidity is very important. It loves humidities above 90%, as a lot of fungi do, and leaf wetness when the leaves are wet for 8 to 12 hours. That's different. They're two different things, leaf wetness and humidity. You can have wet leaves and low humidity, that's a thing, but both of those things will lead to botrytis. Cool temperatures. So this is not a fungus that thrives at high temperatures. 15 to 20 degrees Celsius. Not sure what that is in old money or American, but that's pretty cool, even by English standards. That supports the germination and infection cycles. And then here's the real kicker. Rain splash and overhead irrigation are a really easy way of the spores being dispersed. Now, it doesn't just disperse in rain splash, it doesn't just fly into the air. It can also come off runoff. So if you've got plants that are on plastic sheeting or on concrete on the ground, then it can come out of the runoff and go in from one plant to the other. And in ornamental nurseries here in the UK, professional ornamental nurseries, that's called running botrytis, and that's really difficult to control. In strawberry polytunnels, then that's the reason why a lot of strawberry growers use polytunnels. It's not to increase the heat so much. It's mainly just to prevent rain splash. And in the UK, we call these Spanish tunnels because they don't have sides to them. So if they were there to create a microenvironment and keep the heat in, then they would have sides on them, obviously, and that would increase the temperature and the humidity. But there's no sides on them because they don't want to increase the humidity and they just want to prevent that rain splash. So there's Spanish tunnels for strawberries. You see them all along the hillsides in like Herefordshire. You're going up the M6 in Shropshire, places like this, then you'll see that's what Spanish tunnels are there for. And then you'll notice the plastic is removed when the plants are not flowering and fruiting. And so that's to prevent damage and to increase light levels and prevent algae growth on them. So they're just there to prevent grey mold, really. Humidity and airflow control is also important. So you want to maintain humidity below 80% anyway. You're using dehumidifiers and ventilation. Eliminate free moisture droplets on the leaves and make sure there's air movement will help with that and prevents microclimates as well. So you might have a hygrometer that says it's 70% humidity, but if you've not got good air movement, then you could have a microclimate. One plant or one leaf could be much higher than that. So that's important to note. As I said, sanitation is critical. Remove dead leaves, petals, and plant debris. Yes, it will take time, but these are, especially if they get wet or they're moist and they're not crispy, these plant materials will be producing grey mold spores. Disinfect your tools, surfaces and growing systems. So your growing systems, you're going to be using something like hydrogen peroxide, commercial cleaners for the surfaces, and for tools, use something like a strong vinegar or something like that, or a specialist cleaning implement liquid. Quarantine protocols for all pests and diseases, really, I'm always saying, you've got to quarantine plant material coming in. If you've got expensive genetics, or if the chances of a pest or a disease or something like thrips or grey mold getting in is a big issue, then obviously you want to quarantine and prevent overcrowding as well. So what do you do when you've got grey mold? Well, there are conventional fungicides you can use. Strobilurins, they're a very common one. Depending on where you are, what's registered for grey mold, ipradione, chlorothalonil, they can effective, but face a couple of issues. One's the grey mold can build up resistance to them. And two, do you want to be applying a fungicide just before you harvest a crop? If it's an edible crop or a smokable crop, things like this, then you don't want to be doing that. In cut flowers, they do this. Roses, for example, are commonly dipped in fungicide to prevent grey mold once they've been harvested. But obviously you've got fungicide, pesticide residues on them. So that's why I always say wear gloves when you're handling roses and cut flowers, because they're dipped in fungicide before they leave Kenya and Ecuador and Kunming and places like this. And then there are certain plants that are grouped together in their susceptibility to certain strains of grey mold. And you could, if you were on a nursery that was growing lots of different types of plants, you could group them together and prevent and delay resistance. You could look at applying different fungicides at different times as well to prevent resistance building up, rather than just relying on one fungicide. That's something to consider. There are some biological control methods. Trichoderma, particularly Trichoderma harzianum, that's easy for me to say, can reduce botrytis through competition and antagonism. That's a free-living fungus that is in a lot of mycorrhizal products, Trichoderma harzianum. Chitosan formulations activate plant defenses, degrade fungal cell walls, and prevent infection. So they're promising for hydroponic setups. The beauty of chitosan is that it's non-toxic, unlike the other fungicides. So it's a biofungicide. So we definitely recommend use of chitosan. Certain yeasts and epiphytic fungi have shown strong grey mold suppression, nearly matching chemical fungicides in trials. So that's where brewer's yeast and things like this, they could be a good source of spray. But obviously you need to make sure you know what you're doing with those things. The other part to consider is that there are certain insects that can act as vectors. So a vector is an organism or anything. It's a thing that transfers one biological organism to another. So if you think of bees for pollen, they're a vector. If you think of aphids, they're a vector for viruses. But so are secateurs, so they're a vector. And then when it comes to grey mold, fungus gnats, midges, and even slugs can spread spores between plants. So making sure you get control of your insects is very important, even if the pest numbers are low. Control them through sticky traps. Make sure you control fungus gnats using a variety of different methods and things like that. So another useful method that is becoming even more popular is UV irradiation. And UVC, so about 254 nanometers, can effectively inactivate botrytis spores in the air and on the surface. So they have been used, UVC irradiators, light arrays are being used now on commercial strawberry farms to kill off botrytis. So they go in after the workers have been there, because obviously UVC is highly toxic to humans. It will cause cancer and cataracts, so you have to make sure no one's around exposed to it, and it will control botrytis fairly effectively. There's a few companies looking at that now. I think Saga Robotics, have they got one? That's from the company. UVB and blue lights, they have complex effects. So UVB can stimulate sporulation, but blue light can suppress it. So play around with UVB lights if you've got a UVB light. I wouldn't mess around with UVC unless you know what you're doing, unless you're in an unoccupied room. UVC in air ducts and filters can be an option. There's a few filters that have UV built into them to control spores coming into the grow room. Let's have a look at the plants that are really susceptible. So strawberries, as I've said, geraniums, so pelargoniums, as they're also known, cyclamen. Cyclamen, really, that's the one that gets running botrytis on nurseries. Primula, primroses, and ornamentals like roses. They are the main ones that get botrytis. And botrytis strains can often infect a range of unrelated hosts. So if you've got plants in the garden that have got botrytis, the spores might come in and into your grow room through the inlet fan, unfortunately. And as always, an integrated management strategy is best. So integrated pest management, or integrated pest and disease management, IPM. So in summary, control the humidity, use tunnels if you're a strawberry grower, make sure you've got good airflow, so don't have walls on your tunnels. Make sure you've got fans if you're growing in a grow room. Daily removal of dead leaves and any dead plant material, especially like rotting tomatoes or strawberries on the plants. If they're rotting, remove them. Sterilize your grow room once all the plants are out and you're going for a new grow. Deploy Trichoderma, chitosan, even beneficial yeasts, things like this if you're interested in biocontrol. If you're going to use a fungicide, make sure you rotate them and prevent dip. And if you're going to use like cut flowers, make sure you know that they're dipped in fungicides. And if you're a big grower, then you could look at UVC irradiation. However, if you're a small grower, I'd be very careful of that because it, as I say, it can cause cataracts and cancer if you are exposed to too much of it or any of it, because it's non-natural. It doesn't exist in the Earth's surface. It is, intercepted by the Earth's atmosphere. So unless you're an astronaut, you're not going to be exposed to UVC, or if you're on a strawberry farm that's using UVC to control it. So hopefully they are following all the best practice on those and they're not exposing workers to UVC. So we said grey mold thrives in hydroponic conditions, but with proactive planning, your crops can thrive without it. So as I say, it's one that's really it's going to be a kicker because it can hit once your crop's been harvested or just before harvest. So be aware of grey mold. Make sure you know the symptoms, which is obviously just a grey, really like fluffy growth on your plants, on the leaves. There will also be a human health hazard with grey mold because they're all those spores. If you disturb a load of leaf material that's got grey mold on it, then you could get a big lungful of spores. And that, although not toxic in itself, when you inhale spores in high volumes, you get something called farmer's lung, which is a debilitating disease. So don't get farmer's lung. If you've found this interesting, then please look at your phone now. And especially if you're on Apple Podcasts and you're listening to it, click onto the podcast for Hydroponics Daily and click the plus sign to follow. That would be a big help. Then you wouldn't miss a single episode of this absolute babbling drivel. And yeah, you can listen to other amazing podcasts, episodes about other horrible pathogens that could ruin your day. Thank you very much for listening. We'll do something exciting and interesting and positive tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.